host, Richard Charpentier, and as you can see, I'm a different place traveling through, but staying true to answering the questions. So, without further ado, let's get started. Somebody asked whether or not there is an alternate to replace MCP, which stands for monocalcium phosphate. So, can you replace monocalcium phosphate? Monocalcium phosphate is a fast reacting leavening acid. So it performs 60 to 70% of its CO2 being released be within the first 5 minutes of mixing. So remember, based on what you're making, if you want to replace monocalcium phosphate, what would you replace it with? So there are ingredients like, faster than monocalcium phosphate, like tartaric acid. So I would go with tartaric acid if you're trying to replace that. But remember, as you have a base of sodium bicarbonate, a base will react with any acids. If you were to put lemon juice, it's an acid, it will react. If you're putting vinegar, it will react. So you have to, what's the end result you're trying to accomplish, and whether or not, it's worth removing it. But so far, I would say, it all depends on the volume and the reaction, the rate of reaction you're getting from MCP today that will make a difference. Good question. Another question, somebody is asking about mono agar-agar. So, and whether or not you can, the question goes to how do I use agar-agar in baking cakes, bread, muffins, and other vegan cakes? So agar-agar is basically a dried colloid polysaccharide, and it's extracted from algae, and it's been used for its ability to basically to gel and hold water, but it's not soluble in cold water. So in order to use agar, it is to be cooked up or used into boiling water until you do form a gel. So in order to use it into your cakes and muffin and other things that you're mentioning, you need to find of how will you use the agar-agar in your formulation and to what percent and what level. Because if you have too much water, your water activity will go up, and as your water activity you go up, you're fighting a micro battle, meaning mold will grow faster. So remember, by adding ingredients, you're also changing the overall, structure of your cake. And if you have shelf life, it's something to consider. But overall, it's a good choice. But remember, it's not soluble in cold water, and therefore you need to find a process in which you can cook it or boil it at least. So great question. So now moving on to the next question. Somebody wants to know what is the proper dosage, how to use ammonium bicarbonate in bakery good. So ammonium bicarbonate compared to sodium bicarbonate, which is baking soda, it's used is a common leavening agent and produces CO2 similarly to baking soda with a leavening acid. But one difference is it doesn't need a leavening acid or an acid to react. It will produce CO2 without the need of an acid. And it does not leave an alkaline taste. But also, if you use it, it's best used for cookies, crackers, cream puffs, not really in baked goods. And ammonium bicarbonate also will leave that ammonia flavor aroma that is very typical of ammonium bicarbonate. And I always used it into cookies to get a nice spread. So, and never, because by itself it would allow to really expand and give you the spread in cookies who didn't have enough fats, etc. So, but good question, but not really in bakery goods, cakes. It would not be the first choice to make quality cakes. But thank you for your question. Now to the next question. Somebody wants to know, how can I effectively add cassava flour in bread production without affecting the quality of my bread. So cassava flour or tapioca starch is a starch. So as you're making bread, I'm assuming traditional bread because you didn't mention gluten-free. As you're removing that, you're basically adding more starch and you're diluting the overall protein. Protein are used in breads to create structure, shape, volume, and also shelf life because of the ability of the protein to hold on to the water much better than a starch or a simple carbohydrate. So if you want to replace it, just be aware that if you go too far with the level of carbohydrate, again, your water content will go higher, and then you could have microbial issues such as mold growing a little faster, protein staling because the more carbohydrates you're talking about, starches, you're talking about starch retrogradation, starch staling, but it will help create a softer product. And also your hydration, meaning how much moisture, how much water you're putting in, will be good. But it's going to come to the point when if you go too far, the bread volume will decrease and you will start losing volume. So you have to, again, as I'm saying, make sure you do not go too far. And as a starting point, I would take maybe no more between 2 to 5% of the total flour and maybe replace it with it. I'll start low, start with 2% and see how it gets affected because mixing and water absorption will get affected and therefore will need to be adjusted. Great question. Now for the last question. I have low volume and bad shape on my chocolate chips brioche. Can you explain how oil and chocolate chips affect the volume and the shape? Thank you. Yes, I can. So to answer your question quite simply, the more, remember, when you make a brioche gets its structure how? Through the proper mixing, the proper development, through having the gluten well developed to hold on the shape. And the eggs will help you with the structure and the texture you're getting from the brioche. That's why it's so good, right? Everybody loves the brioche. But now as you're adding more fat, usually the fat of choice in the brioche is always butter or something a little more solid that you can delay and add later on. If you're putting oil, it's going to make it a little heavier. And how much eggs do you have in your brioche? And also there's the amount of inclusions, meaning the chocolate chips you're putting in. It has to be supported by the structure you're building to make a good brioche. So if you go too far in both in the oil and the inclusion of the chocolate chips, you will see a decrease in your volume and you could see a denser, gummier product. But all great questions. So thank you very much for doing another Tuesday 10 out of 10. Sorry about the background, but thank you. You guys are great and happy baking, and we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.